I'm Steve Ricker, the Director of Interpretation for the Over Mountain Victory Trail Association, and I'm going to share a story with you guys today of the Over Mountain Men, the Battle of Kings Mountain. I'm going to do it in first-person interpretive programming, like somebody that was actually at the battle. So I'll get started. My name is Thomas Morgan. I was born in the Shenandoah Valley up in Virginia, and as I grew, we had moved down into the Piedmont of North Carolina. And by the time I became a man with a family of my own, I'd become quite the hunter. Problem was, game was getting scarce. It was hard to provide for my family. I had heard about a few venturous men that had crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains over into the Cherokee territory, men like William Bean, James Robinson, and they came back with tales of game that was so thick you could hunt all day. They came back with tales of the ground that was so rich you could drop a grain of corn and it would grow right there. And I had heard later on that people had went over the mountain against the rule of King George III and started settling, leasing land from the Cherokees, making treaties with the Cherokee. And I've got to tell you, this really appealed to me. In 1774, I talked the wife into going. We packed up the young'uns and what we could carry on a horseback, crossed over the top of the Blue Ridge down into the Watauga Valley, and sure enough, folks had started settling there. I'd heard about a man named Jacob Brown that had opened a trading post on the Nolichucky River. Went and got a fine piece of land from this man. And we worked day and night, clearing, building a cabin, planting crops. But you know, for the first time in my life, I was free. Wasn't living under the rule of King George III. We were on the edge of the world and we were totally free. But like every other man that had crossed those mountains, I joined the militia. Served under Colonel John Sevier, Nolichucky Jacks, what we called him. And they used us to protect the settlements from hostile Indian raids. They used us to build roads, to build barns. And in 1776, we had quite a bit of problem with the Cherokee. But we had heard about a man by the name of George Washington that took a stand against the British up north. But I gotta tell you, that war seemed a lifetime away from us. We were on the edge of the frontier. We didn't think it'd even affect us, but we were wrong. By 1780, the war had been dragging out up north for 5 years, and King George was getting tired of it. He wanted to put an end to this revolution. So Sir Henry Clinton, the overall commander of the British forces, came up with an idea. They called it their Southern Strategy. He loaded his army up on ships, sailed down the East Coast, laid siege to Charleston, Savannah, all the big ports in the South. Their plan was to raise an army of loyalists, to train them in the British coat of arms, march his army over the Carolinas, catch George Washington between these two armies, put an end to the revolution. Their plan was working rather well. Seeing that his plan was working, Sir Henry Clinton sailed back to New York, and he left in charge of all the Southern British forces Major Lord Charles Cornwallis. Now, he had two officers working under him, a man by the name of Bannister Tarleton, one by the name of Major Patrick Ferguson. Ferguson's job was to protect his western flank and to raise an army of loyalists, Americans just like us, but they were still loyal to King George. He was going to train them, and he was raising quite the army. But in the meantime, some of the Patriot leaders on this side of the Blue Ridge had took a stand against the British, men like Charles and Joseph McDowell, Elijah Clark, Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and the British armies would be encamped. There would be a whole group of frontiersmen come out of the woods, lay into them, inflicting casualties, and then disappear right back into the mountains. And they couldn't catch them. This became quite an aggravation for Ferguson. His army was camped at a place called Musgrove Mills, and there was a band of screaming frontiersmen come out of the woods, inflicted casualties, and disappeared one more time into the mountains. Ferguson had had enough. He had captured a young man by the name of Samuel Phillips, and he sent young Samuel back over the mountains with a message for all us, the over mountain men, he called us. And this is the message he sent to us. He told us to lay down our arms, pledge loyalty to King George, or he would march his army over the mountain. He would lay waste our homes and crops with fire and sword, and he would hang our leaders. He made a mistake. As soon as that threat came over the mountain to Colonel Isaac Shelby, he contacted his good friend Colonel John Sevier, and they began to call up the militias. We didn't know it at the time, but they had contacted Colonel William Campbell up in Southwest Virginia about helping us. All I know was I was behind my cabin laying up wood for the winter. My neighbor come riding up, said, "Get your rifle, get your horse. They're calling up the militia." I said, "Why? We ain't had trouble with the Cherokee in a long time." He said, "No, it's the British." He told me of this threat and my blood was boiling. I saddled my horse, got my rifle, my bag and horn, kissed my wife goodbye, and as we rode up the Nolichucky River toward Colonel Sevier's place, they were men coming out of every holler. We were swarming like yellow jackets. Everybody was mad. By the time we got to the colonel's place, there were 240 of us. We cut up Cherokee Creek, headed to Fort Watauga because it was agreed that's where we'd meet. We come riding into Fort Watauga. Colonel Isaac Shelby was there with 240 men from the Holston. About an hour later, here come Colonel William Campbell with 200 Virginians. A couple hours later, here come his cousin Arthur Campbell with 200 more Virginians. Our army was growing. As we camped on the banks of the river that night, there were campfires as far as your eyes could see. I had no idea what we were going to do. The commanders that got together at the fort made a decision. They said, "Ferguson, he wants a fight. Well, let's give him one. But we won't fight him over here in our cornfields around our family. We'll take it to him." Now, the next morning, we were getting prepared to leave. There was a young lady by the name of Miss Mary Patton. She made some of the finest gunpowder you could ever hope to get. She brought us in 500 pounds of quick burning gunpowder. As we're getting ready to mount our horses, there was a young Presbyterian minister, a man by the name of Samuel Doak. He stepped up and he delivered a sermon and a prayer, told us to go fight with the sword of the Lord and of Gideon, and that became one of our battle cries. As we began to ride out from the fort, we was driving some cattle for provision. It began to rain. We got to the bottom of the mountain, place that the old people call the resting place. We called it the Shelving Rock. It's a big rock overhang. So we put all of our powder under that rock overhang at night to keep it dry in the rain. Laid out in the field in the rain. Got up the next morning, realized that we couldn't drive the cattle over the mountain, so we slaughtered what we could carry, sent the rest back. We took to the saddle that morning and headed straight up the mountain where the trail crossed over.